The first place that we start is right here. We're going to look for the absolute value of black, which is always the pupil. So just take a tiny bit of black paint and you're going to paint in the pupil. Try to make sure that it's looking circular. Does not take much paint. This is acrylic paint, so it dries fairly quickly. Okay, then you're going to rinse out your brush. We're using these rags because they're much more absorbent than our classroom paper towels. So these rags are not for wiping paint on. They're for after you rinse the brush, just dab the water out of your brush. We're not using watercolor. So when you're working on your portrait painting, if you're using a lot of water, it's not going to look right. You're not going to be able to build the layers up like you're trying to. Okay, so we've already started with a middle tone background, and actually it's lighter than middle tone, and the next batch of paint I mixed up was slightly lighter. So the next thing we're going to do is shade the sphere of the eyeball. Your eyeball is actually round like a sphere. So we're going to come in here, and it doesn't take much paint. So on our paint palette, we're going to mix up something a little darker than our mid-tone. So notice on my plate, see, I'm not mixing much paint. And if I've got a nice detail brush, I'm not going to want to scrub and mess this brush up. So I'm just going to test it out here. It's a little bit darker. I'm going to make it a little bit darker. Okay, now I want you to get in the habit, after you mix the value you need, I want you to get in the habit of rinsing out your brush. Get the paint out of your brush, because if you have a bunch of paint in your brush, it's going to be hard to control. So now I'm just going to take a little bit of that darker paint that I mixed up. Just watch me do this, and then you try it, okay? That way you can see exactly what I'm doing. I'm going to wet the surface of the sclera. And I'm going to work quickly here, because if this area is wet, okay, I'm going to rinse, dab. Now I'm going to pick up a little bit of the dark gray, and I'm going to darken the top part of that area. And if both of the values are wet, then I will be able to watch closely here. Both values are still wet, so I can dab and soften. So I'm dabbing the extra paint off of my brush, and I'm softening these values together. So I'm blending that edge together. Okay, so now I'm going to do the same thing across here. Okay, if you look at the guide, there's a shadow across the eyeball, all the way across the top, and then we're going to kind of do the same thing. We're going to wrap it around the bottom just slightly. We don't really need to go across the bottom of the iris, because that's going to be lighter anyway. Okay, so I'm going to take my middle value gray and go ahead and wet the surface. This will be very helpful when you're painting the skin in your portrait. You'll want that base value to be wet so that you can pick up your darker or lighter values and make those adjustments. I did not mix enough paint, so I'm going to mix up a little bit more of my dark right here. I'm going to clean out my brush, dab out the water, and now pick up just a little bit of paint that I can control. I'm going to pull this shadow right across the top of the eyeball. And because it's wet paint on wet paint, I can blend it It's drying really fast. If you need to repeat the process, go ahead. You can put a little bit of lighter gray and then pick up the dark. Blending. Okay, I'm going to do the same thing, just wrapping it around the bottom here. It's important to note that we're just painting a generic eye. There's no absolute way when you're looking at your photograph. It all depends on where the light's coming from. It all depends on how much your eyes are in the shadows or in the light. That will tell you where to put these values. But we're just talking about the basics of a generic eye, knowing that an eyeball is round, knowing what to do to kind of make it look a little bit more round. So I'm going to put a little bit of shading on the bottom part of the eye. Follow your guide. Just, if I get it too dark, I can always lighten it up. I also use my finger to blend it often. If you want to do that, you can do that. I'm not going to stop you from using your finger to blend the paint. Yes, it will get on your finger, but it will come off. Okay. You can also pop a little bit of darker value in the coruncle, and you'll notice usually in a photograph, let's look at this one. Usually in a photograph, these values will be darker in one area and lighter in one area. In this picture, it just so happens that the darker part is on the eyeball and the light is catching on the skin of the coruncle. In my photograph, however, the one that I'll be using for this painting, it's all a little bit darker down in there. So again, it all depends on the lighting in your photograph. So I'm going to just paint a little bit darker in that area. Okay, the next step would be to, study your picture. Usually the sclera, the white part of the eye, will look a little bit lighter right on either side of the iris. It's probably going to be catching some light. Let's look at this one. This one, it's a whole lot lighter right here, but still not perfectly white. It's darker on this side. So again, it depends on your picture. Mine is lighter on this side, darker on this side. But when doing a generic eye, I'm going to not take bright white, but a little bit of my based gray. I'll call that a base tone. I'm going to lighten it up a little bit. Let me see if this is too light. Oh, that's probably just about right. So I'm just going to lighten just a little bit. I barely had any paint on my brush. Another thing on this paper we're using, this is just cardstock. This worksheet is copied on cardstock, and it's not the best painting paper. It's kind of absorbent, so our paint is drying pretty quickly. I just have such a habit of blending with my fingers. It just works the best for me. I'm going to make this side a little bit lighter. Okay, and then no matter what color your iris is, we're going to paint the iris darker at the top, medium value in the middle, and then we're going to make it a little bit lighter at the bottom. So if you have a dark brown iris, you'll just make the whole thing darker, but you'll still try to make those 3 values, because this is going to create a little reflection in your eye and make it a little bit easier to see, or make it look a little more realistic. So I'm going to take a little bit of dark. So now I'm just focused on this iris. Okay, I can rinse, dab the water out, pick up a little bit of medium gray. Oops, I have a little bit too much water in there. I can mop it up. If you get too much water, just mop it up on the brush, dab it on the rag, mop it up, dab it. I'm going to blend that dark and that medium together right there. Okay, now I'm going to put lighter at the bottom. So this will create a little reflection in the eye. That dried instantly. The instant I put it on there, it dried. So I'm going to put a little bit of that base gray on there. Now pick up some light. Okay, so you have these guides at your table. We're just following this step by step. Notice I put a little darker shadow along this, the skin and that coruncle. So that's something you can do if you see it. Usually creates a separation there. And then you're going to want to study what's going on around the outside of your iris. So for our generic eye today, a lot of eyes will have a dark ring. It'll be darker around the outer edge of the iris. So I'm going to proceed and darken the edge. Again, that dried instantly. That will not do that on your canvas. Like when you're painting on your canvas, you'll have quite a few more seconds to work before your paint dries. On this paper, it's drying instantly. So notice today I'm only having you paint the eyeball. That is the first thing we're going to paint on your portraits, and we will paint the environment of the eye, meaning the eye socket, the skin, the eyelids, everything around the eye. We will paint that as we're studying the photographs, studying the shadows in the skin, and then eyelashes will be one of the very last things that you would paint on there after you're finished painting the environment of the eye. once you get that just the way you want it, then you will pop the eyelashes in there. Okay, last couple of things, then we'll clean up. Oftentimes you'll see texture in the iris. Sometimes you can actually see lines. Sometimes they'll just look like speckles. And so when you're painting your self-portrait, if you can't see what's going on in your eye in your photograph, maybe it's just too dark, maybe the copy or printed it off too dark. We have mirrors, and then I want you to study your own eye, see what this texture, visual texture is doing. Like, do you have lines? Do you have speckles? And so then you'll just paint that in the way you see it. So if you see it as little shapes of lines, if they are lines though, however, they will radiate out from the center. So the very last thing you'll do is pop in the highlights, but first you want to try to get the texture of the eye right. So for our generic eye today, we can just take a little bit of darker value and just put some lines. Ooh, that's going to dry so quick. So I would pop them in there and then smudge them with your finger. Think about like the spokes on a bicycle. If you just paint them in there as a sharp line and let it dry, it's not going to look very realistic. So you can pull the lines in there. Some will be smudged more, some will be long. You might see a few speckles that are a little darker. They might appear, it's possible they might appear to be coming from the outline of the iris. Sometimes that'll happen. You'll have a little texture coming from the outside edge. Okay, so just make sure make sure you smudge it. You don't want it to be super sharply outlined. Okay. Then you put in the reflections. So something to know is both eyes, we're only painting one eye, but the sparkles in your eye, they will always be level with the other eye. They will be in the same spot and they will be level because it's going to have the same light source reflecting. For example, in this photograph of my eye, the reflection is in the top left edge of my pupil. Okay? Top left edge of my pupil. So you just take barely, sometimes it appears as one, sometimes it appears as multiple, sometimes there's one on the other side. I'm going to smudge it. So I popped it in there, absolute white, and smudge it, okay? You may also see some reflections in other areas. So you may see a little bit of reflection in the bottom of your iris. You might see a reflection on the sclera, the white part of the eye. So you just have to use your value judgment. And that's what we're going to talk about the next couple of days, is how to make value judgments and make a decision on what to do in your painting based on the value judgment.